Shalom Havarim, James Trim here, and we are ready for lesson 4 through the book of Hebrews. In lesson 4, we will be going right into the heavenly Holy of Holies, and we'll also be getting to the climax. Everything up to this point has been building the premise of Paul's main point that he is getting to in this next homiletic midrash, Proem homiletic midrash. And as I've told you before, this is the entire book of Hebrews is an extended Proem homiletic midrash on Psalm 110, verse 4. I'm sorry, 110, and this is the midrash on verse 4, and throughout the extended homiletic midrash, it's a chain of the book itself forms a chain of midrashim on each of that deal with the themes of different parts of Psalm 110 verse 4 or Psalm 110 1 and 4. And here we're dealing with just that 110 Psalm 110 verses 1 and 4 brought together as he brings the climax of his point. And the initial text is Jeremiah chapter 31 that will be dealt with in chapter 8 of the book of Hebrews. Chapter 8 of the book of Hebrews deals with Jeremiah chapter 31. And it deals with the Brit Chadashah, which is talked about in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, and also touched on again in 32. And you have to understand in context. And then, of course, it ties that in later with Exodus 24:8. So let's start with Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1, just picking back up where we left off. Now, the things which we have spoken, of the things that we have spoken, this is the sum. In other words, I'm getting now to my point. I'm going to pull it all together and I'm going to tell you what it is that I've got to say here. We have such a high priest, talking about this Melchizedek figure that we discussed last week. We have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens. So here's our setting. Our setting is, as we've talked about in previous weeks, the book of Hebrews deals with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That is the primary subject matter of the book, as well as Psalm 110. And chapter 8 gives us the setting that we see here in Psalm 110. We're right there in the heavenly Holy of Holies at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Just as he says, come and sit at my right hand in Psalm 110, to the Melchizedek figure. Something else that's very important about Hebrews 8 and 9 and the setting in the heavenly Holy of Holies is that it's exactly the same setting that we see in Romans chapters 4 and 5. And none of the commentaries that I know of point this out, but it's something that I have long pointed out in teachings that I've done both on Hebrews and on Revelations and on the set that tie into these particular ideas and sections. In Hebrews chapters 8 and 9, as we will find, we see the Messiah pictured as a high priest, in this case, as a lamb in Revelation, at the right hand of the throne. Now we know it's at the right hand of the throne in Revelation because the sealed book is in the right hand of the figure on the throne, and he's taking the sealed book or receiving the sealed book. In Hebrews chapter 8 and 9, as we will see, the Messiah is at the right hand of the throne, and he's doing something because of his blood, and I'll point this out as we keep going through, that only he can do because of his blood. And in Revelations chapter 5 and 6, the Messiah, pictured as the Lamb, is doing something with his blood that only he is able to do because of his blood. Excuse me. And so we have this parallel going on. But the final step of the parallel is that in Hebrews 8 and 9, as we will find out, the Messiah is becoming mediator of the new covenant. And in Revelations 5 and 6, he is opening the book sealed with 7 seals. And so there's a profound thing that we can learn here. The profound thing that we can learn is that opening the book sealed with 7 seals in Revelation is the same thing as becoming mediator of the new covenant in Hebrews 8 and 9. And that opens up some profound implications as to understanding what the sealed book is in the book of Revelation and understanding what the new covenant is. The word new covenant in Hebrew, well, let's get to that in a minute. I'm jumping ahead. So Hebrews 8, verse 2, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which Yahweh pitched, and not man. Because when the tabernacle was made in the Torah, it says that it was made according to a pattern. In other words, that there was a heavenly tabernacle that served as the pattern for the earthly one. For the high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, whereof it is necessary that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing there are priests that offer gifts according to the Torah. And because he was not a Levite, he wasn't serving in the temple priesthood, who serve in the example and shadow of heavenly things. As in other words, in the heavenly tabernacle, parallel to the earthly tabernacle / temple, in which there are heavenly services taking place that correspond to the earthly ones, because all the things that take place in the earthly temple are all these rituals are actually allegorical. They're literally allegorical, and they're allegorically literal. They are shadows. They are types of truths, if you will, that are of the heavenly tabernacle, okay, and the heavenly Holy of Holies. Verse 5, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished to Elohim when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mount. So that is, as we said, reflecting back on the idea that that there's a heavenly tabernacle that served as the model for the earthly one. And now has he obtained a more excellent ministry, by now which also he is mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. Now, it doesn't mean that there were faults with the covenant, as we will understand in the text here as we go forward. There was no fault in the covenant. The fault was with us. If we had not had faults under the covenant, we would not have needed a new covenant. But now we can address what this actually means. When it says new covenant, the Hebrew is Brit Chadashah, and Brit means covenant. Chadashah means new, but it doesn't necessarily mean brand spanking new, didn't exist before. It is a word that's used regularly to mean renewed. For example, Rosh Chodesh, from the same root, is the word for new moon. Okay, it's not a brand spanking new moon that didn't exist before. It's a renewal of the same moon as it goes through the lunar cycles. Verse 8, for finding fault with them. Verse 8 tells us the fault wasn't as many Christians read verse 7, with the Torah. The fault was with them, the people. He says, "Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, when I will make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." Now we're getting into Jeremiah chapter 31. And what Paul is saying is there would not have been a need for a renewal of the covenant if they had not had faults under the first one, they the people. Verse 9, in other words, had Israel not violated the covenant, there wouldn't have been a need for a renewal of the covenant. Verse 9, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers. Now, this is actually, we're in Jeremiah chapter 31 now, that Paul is quoting for most of the rest of this chapter. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, says Yahweh. The Hebrew, I believe, says, although I was a husband to them. Interestingly, that word for husband in the Hebrew is Baal. A lot of people don't realize this. In that case, the word Baal is actually applied to Yahweh. Baal means Lord or husband in Hebrew. Okay. And then the other interesting thing about this verse is that notice it says that I made with them in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. Now, the word day in Hebrew is yom, which does not always denote a 24-hour cycle. It can mean a 24-hour cycle. It can mean just the roughly 12 hours of daylight as opposed to nighttime. Or, and some people don't realize this, it can simply mean a period of time. We have the same usage in English for day in all three cases. We use day to refer to a 24-hour day. We use day to refer to daytime as opposed to nighttime. And we'll use the word day to refer to a non-specific period of time that can mean years. For example, I could say that poem is from Shakespeare's day. That doesn't mean Shakespeare only lived during the daytime or that Shakespeare only lived 24 hours. In that case, it means during his entire lifetime, which was years, and not a 24-hour period. In this case, the covenant at Sinai was made about 50 days after the departure from Egypt. So here we have a period of about 50 days that's referred to as a Yom day. Okay. But there's another element here we're going to get to, because a lot of people don't understand the new covenant, and that the new covenant is actually a renewal of the Torah as found in the so-called Old Covenant, if you will. The new covenant was in the Torah all along, as we're going to find out here. Verse 10, "For this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my Torah, my laws, into their mind, and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them an Elohim, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest." Has that happened yet? No. Verse 12, "For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more." Verse 13 is the first verse out of Jeremiah 31. So Jeremiah 31's quote has been finished, and the King James Version has, "In that day, and then he said, a new covenant, he has made the first old. Now that which decays and waxes old is ready to vanish away." All right, now we've got a lot of handouts to look at here, and including one on that verse, relative to Hebrews chapter 8 and understanding Hebrews chapter 8. I want you to put your finger or ribbon or whatever you can mark with there. I want you to turn in the Torah back to Deuteronomy chapters 28 and 29. Now, this section of Deuteronomy actually starts in 28:1. 28:1 through verse 14 gives a list of blessings promised to Israel for observing the Torah. And then starting in verses 15 through roughly the end of chapter 28 is a list of curses that will be brought upon Israel for not keeping Torah. And then we get to chapter 29, verse 1 in Christian versions. Now, if you're using a Jewish version, it's chapter 28, verse 69. So there's a little difference here. There's also a difference in Jeremiah chapter 31. I'll be using, because I didn't make note of it here in my notes, just the Christian versification, but in the Hebrew and in Jewish versions, it may be a verse off of the Hebraic roots version, and some other messianic editions will have both versifications in place. All right, so chapter 29, verse 1, which is the last verse of chapter 28 in the Hebrew. These are the words of the covenant which Yahweh commanded Moshe to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, beside the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Now this is important. This is important because this is not the covenant that was made at Sinai. That was already made at the beginning of the 40 years. This covenant was made at the end of the 40 years. And this covenant, the covenant at Moab, is actually the new covenant. So it really hasn't been made yet, to an extent, in that it is a promise of covenant renewal. So it says, beside the covenant which I made with them in Horeb. So it's not the Horeb is Sinai, so it's not the same covenant. So it's a covenant that I made with them, but not the one that I made with them at Horeb. And Jeremiah 31 starts out and says, behold, the days, says Yahweh, that I will make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Yehudah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. In other words, not at the time I made a covenant with them at Sinai. So there's very similar wording here. We have a new covenant or renewal of covenant that is talked about here that's not like the covenant it's besides the covenant he made with them at Sinai. It's not like the covenant that he made with them at that time in Jeremiah 31. Then if we move on to chapter, how do I do this in order? We're going to move around we have our handout. Let's do this. For convenience sake, I'm going to set the scripture aside. We have a handout here I've been following, by the way. And that handout says, covenant at Moab compared to the new covenant. And we just went over the top two items there, comparing Deuteronomy 28:69 or 29:1 to Jeremiah 31:31 through 32. Now, if we compare Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 2 and 6, we read, and shall return unto Yahweh your Elohim. These are terms of this renewed covenant. It says, talking about if you shall return unto Yahweh your Elohim and hearken to his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul. This is saying in context that after these curses come upon you, if then you repent and return to me, and Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your, and that you may live. Now, a lot of people may not realize that circumcised hearts are actually talked about in the Torah and in the prophets, and they're not a New Covenant thing or a New Testament thing. The book known as the New Testament. which is not the New Testament or New Covenant. I prefer to call it the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes. Jeremiah 32, verse 40b says, "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after these days, says Yahweh. I will put my Torah in their inward parts, and in their heart I will write it. And I will put, and then in verse 40 he says, and I will put my fear in their hearts that they may not depart from me." This sounds like the covenant of Moab, doesn't it? The covenant of Moab we read in chapter 29, verse 12, or verse 13 in Christian versions, "That he may establish you this day unto himself for a people, and that he may be unto you an Elohim, as he spoke unto you, and as he swore unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov." In Jeremiah 31:33, he says, "I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people." In chapter 2, verse 38, he says, "And they shall be my people, and will be their Elohim." And then in 30, verses 3 through 4, he says, "And then Yahweh your Elohim will turn your captivity and have compassion on you, and will return and gather you from all the peoples where Yahweh your Elohim has scattered you. If any of you," oh, that's Deuteronomy 30. I'm sorry, that's actually misplaced in our little handout here. That should be on the other side of the chart. "From the othermost parts of heaven, from there Yahweh your Elohim will gather you, and from there will he fetch you." That's actually, if you see that quote is from Deuteronomy 30, it's on the wrong side of the chart. And then, "Behold, I will gather them out of the countries where I have driven them in my anger and in my fury and in great wrath, and I will bring them back into this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely." The Deuteronomy side of the handout, we see, "And Yahweh your Elohim will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and you will do, and he will do you good and multiply you above your fathers." That's Deuteronomy 30, verse 5, and as we saw, verses 30 through 4, which is embedded here on the wrong side. That then Yahweh your Elohim will turn your captivity and have compassion on you, and will return and gather you from all the peoples where Yahweh your Elohim has scattered you. If any of you that are dispersed be in your utmost parts of heaven, from there will Yahweh your Elohim gather you, and from there will he fetch you. So you can see how this parallels. These two covenants are the same. So the so-called New Covenant, the renewed covenant, is the renewal of covenant that's promised in the covenant of Moab. Okay? This brings us to the teaching of Ramban. Ramban is one of the greatest, most authoritative commentators in Rabbinic Judaism on the Torah, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. He lived in the 12th century. Well, a little bit in the 12th century, mostly in the 13th century. And this is what he writes in his commentary on Deuteronomy 29:6, talking about the covenant at Moab. He says, "And Yahweh your Elohim," this is in your handout, okay? "And Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart." Deuteronomy 36. "It is this which the rabbis have said. If someone comes to purify himself, they assist him from on high." That's a quote from the Talmud. "The verse assures you that you will return to him with all with all your heart, and with all your heart he will help you." The following subject is very apparent from Scripture. Since the time of creation, man has had the power to do as he pleased. In other words, to have free will. The word for free will in Hebrew is yetzer. Yetzer, we have two. We have the yetzer ra and the yetzer tov, the good inclination and the bad, the evil inclination and the good inclination. The yetzer ra is the evil inclination. The yetzer tov is the good inclination. So man has had the power to do as he pleased, to be righteous or wicked. This grant of free will applies likewise to the entire Torah period, so that people can gain merit from choosing good and punishment for preferring evil. But in the days of Messiah, the choice of their genuine good will be natural. This is talking about the millennial kingdom. The choice of their genuine good will be natural. The heart will not desire the improper, and it will have no craving whatever for it. This is similar to what Paul talks about, and there's a whole idea about the death of the Yetzer Ra, the evil inclination, which you found out about in our Romans study, if you've been through our study in Romans. This is the circumcision mentioned here, for lust and desire are the foreskin of the heart, and circumcision of the heart means that it will not covet or desire evil. Man will return at that time to what he was before the sin of Adam, when by his nature, he did what would properly be done, and there was no conflicting desires in his will, as I have explained in Seder Bereshit, in his commentary on Genesis. It is this which Scripture states in the book of Jeremiah 31:30. Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, but this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Eternal. I will put my Torah in their inward parts, and in their heart I will write it. So here he's identifying the covenant of the new covenant of Jeremiah 31:31 with the covenant at Moab in Deuteronomy 29 and 30. He continues, this is a reference to the annulment of the evil instinct, in this translation, evil inclination, in other words, the Yetzer Ra, and to the natural performance by the heart of its proper function. Therefore, Jeremiah said further, I will put their Elohim, I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. Now it is known that the imagination of a man's heart is evil from his youth. In other words, he is born with a Yetzer Ra, an evil inclination. And it is necessary to instruct them. But at that time, it will not be necessary to instruct them to avoid evil, for the evil inclination will then be completely abolished. And so it is declared by Ezekiel, a new heart I will also give you, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will cause you to walk in my statutes. Ezekiel 36:26. The new heart alludes to a man's nature, and the new spirit to the desire and will. It is this which our rabbis have said, and the years draw nigh when you shall say, I have no pleasure in them. These are the days of Messiah, as they will offer opportunity neither for merit nor guilt. For in the days of the Messiah there will be no evil inclination in man, but he will naturally perform the proper deeds, and therefore there will be neither merit nor guilt in him, for merit and guilt are dependent upon desire or inclination. Again, Ramban on Deuteronomy 29:6. Amazing chachma in those words in Rabbi Nachman's commentary as he draws together the covenant of Moab with the renewed covenant of Jeremiah and ties it to the Messiah and the destruction of Yetzer Ra, as we had learned about previously when we did our study through the book of Romans. If you haven't done that study, go find our study on the book of Romans, and I think that is actually in the handouts in that study too, and go through that and learn it. It's good stuff. Okay, so now let's talk about Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, which culminates all of this, and the King James Version, got what, my whistler? The King James Version from the Greek says, in that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first old. Now that which decays and waxes old is ready to vanish away. Now, who said new? Not Paul. Paul's quoting Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah said new covenant, used the term new covenant, way back in approximately 600 BCE. not long before the destruction of the Second Temple. I believe that was, it may have been after, but I think that was written before. I have to go back and look. But Jeremiah lived around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, of the First Temple, around 600 BC. All right, that said, nobody has a theology that says that the Torah was done away with in 600 BCE. So to come along with and conclude that because the phrase New Covenant was used, the Old Covenant is done away, would have meant that since Jeremiah was the one using it, that the Old Covenant was done away with in 600 BCE, which nobody believes. All right, so the key is what the Hebrew actually says in the Munster text, my translation of the Munster text here in the New Hebraic Roots Version. And according to that which he said, renewed covenant, he has antiquated the first to that which has put on antiquity, and in coming days, behold, he offers that which is longed for. In other words, we've been longing for the renewal of the covenant, and he in coming days offers it. All right, now let's get on to Hebrews chapter 9. Going back to Hebrews chapter 9 and starting in verse 1. Then truly the first covenant also had, verily the first covenant also had ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. For there was a tabernacle made first, wherein was the candlestick, and the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer, and the ark of the covenant, overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. I'm going to keep going here. And over it, the cherubims of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly, because there's so much Paul could have talked about those. And maybe we'll do a study on that someday, on what Paul didn't say. But I want to address the fact that in verses 3 through 4, the incense is described as being in the Holy of Holies. And we have a handout in here just because you should want to remember this forever. Anti-missionaries, and sadly enough, some from within our own ranks that have attacked the book of Hebrews, complain that it says that the Holy of Holies had the golden altar of incense. Now, it's true, the golden altar of incense was outside the veil, but the context here, as we've said consistently, is the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take the incense from the golden altar of incense and place it in the Holy of Holies. Leviticus chapter 16, verses 12 through 13. So Hebrews is telling us the Holies had the golden altar of incense because it was being filled with the incense from the altar. Because Paul wants to drive home to us that it's Yom Kippur in his what he's laying out here for us. Has to do with Yom Kippur. All right. Let's continue. Verse 6. And then these things were thus ordained. The priests went always into the first tabernacle according to the service of Elohim. Let me check my handouts here. Okay. But into the second went the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself for the errors of the people. The Holy Spirit, this in signifying, I'm using the King James Version, but I'm kind of can't help but update as I go a bit, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while at the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time when present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience. In other words, the sacrificial offerings, let me finish verse 10 and then I'll cover this, which stood only in meats and drinks and diverse washings and cardinal ordinances imposed upon them until the time of Reformation. Okay, so the sacrificial offerings did not make anybody, they weren't magical, they didn't take away sin. These things were always symbolic. They were always symbolic. So the sacrificial offerings, when they were being offered in the temple, both before and after the Messiah, by the way, that's another study, up until the destruction of the temple. Paul participated in that in Acts 18:18 and Acts 21. We'll get into that in chapter 10 of Hebrews anyway. So put a pin there for next study. Verse 11, but Messiah, being a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once to the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. This is what I told you about. This is one of those parallels of Revelation. He's able to do something because of his own blood. For as the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of the heifer sprinkling and unclean sanctifies the purifying of the flesh, how much more then shall the blood of Messiah, by the way, this is a kol vechomer statement. It's Paul using the first rule of Hillel, which is if X is true of Y, how much more so it must be true of Z, where Z is Y is of greater weight than Z. Okay, how much? So this is using rabbinic hermeneutics here. He's using the first rule of Hillel. How much more shall the blood of Messiah, who through his eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to Elohim, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living Elohim God. Verse 15. Is that where I think the next handout, I've got these a little backwards here in order unless I got my own scrambled, but the next handout we want to look at is chapter 9, verse 15, the hall of the afflicted. Verse 15 says, for this cause he is the mediator of the new covenant or New Testament by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament. They which are called mighty receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. So who is the renewed covenant made with? Well, Jeremiah said the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And here he says it was made with those that had sins under the first covenant. All right. Verse 15 also brings us to this idea that he's becoming mediator of the new covenant. So in Hebrews 8:9, Messiah is becoming mediator of the new covenant. And in Romans, because of his blood at the right hand of the throne. And in Revelations 5 and 6, he is opening the book sealed with 7 seals by his blood, because in the heavenly of holies at the right hand of the throne, because we're told the book is in the right hand. All right. There is a beautiful little section here in the Zohar that I want to read that's in the handout, the Hall of the Afflicted. The Zohar says, in the Garden of Eden there is a hall that is called the Hall of the Afflicted. Now as it is into this hall that the Messiah goes and summons all afflictions and pains and sufferings of Israel to come upon him. So they all come upon him. And had he not ceased the children of Israel of sorrow, had he not eased the children of Israel of their sorrow and taken their burden upon himself, there would be none who could endure the sufferings of Israel in penalty of neglecting the Torah. Thus it is written, surely our diseases he did bear, and our pains he carried, quoting Isaiah 53:5. Um, Obviously, Isaiah 53 talking about the suffering servant. As long as the children of Israel dwelt in the Holy Land, they averted all the afflictions and sufferings from the world by the service of the sanctuary and by the sacrifice. Not literally, but allegorically. But now it is the Messiah who is averting them from the habitants of the world. That's in the Zohar, yeah. All right, now we continue verses 16 and 17. Excuse me, verses 16 and 17. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator lives. This is one of the most misunderstood passages in all of Scripture. I can't tell you the number of sermons out there where people are talking to you about this as a last will and testament. It is not. In fact, under Jewish law, there's no such thing as a last will and testament. Under Jewish law, the firstborn inherits a double portion, and the co-heirs inherit a equal portion thereafter, and it doesn't matter what's written on a piece of paper. But the word here isn't testament, as we have in the English, it's covenant. Where there is a covenant, there is no heirship power without the death of the covenantor. This gets into the mechanics of how we are saved, okay, and what's really transpiring here in the covenant. And we have a model of this in how David became king of Israel. David became king of Israel when Samuel anointed him king, yes. But what happened when Samuel anointed him king? He said, no, I'm not going to usurp the king of Israel. I'm not going to usurp Saul. And he didn't. And he said, this is impossible. I'm from the wrong tribe. I'm not even in line to become king. You're Samuel, you're Meshuggah. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm not going to. All right. But that's one day, as we read through in the book of Samuel, King David enters into a covenant relationship with David in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. I have this written up by here, a handout for verses 16 through 17, the blood covenant paradigm. So, in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 and 4, David and Jonathan enter into a blood covenant with one another. When you entered into a blood covenant with somebody in ancient Israel, you became their co-heir. You became like brothers. You became a member of their house. If somebody came against you, they were coming against your blood brother, your covenantor, your joint. You then became their joint heir. The day that happened, David became joint heir with Jonathan, the son of the king. I'm sure that when that happened, right afterwards, suddenly a light went on in Jonathan, and David said, he says, Samuel was right. This is how it happens. And of course, Saul and Jonathan were both killed in a single day in battle. And David inherited the throne legitimately. He didn't ride in and take over because he was Jonathan's joint heir. And this is what Paul is talking about. This is a picture of what happens with us as joint heirs with the Messiah. You see, David had a covenant with the son of the king. And when the son of the king died, David, as his joint heir, had an inheritance. We have a covenant with the son of the king. And when the son of the king died, we were entitled as his joint heirs to an inheritance. Okay. Verse 19. Did I read verse 18? Whereupon either the first testament was dedicated without blood. Verse 19. And when Moshe spoke had spoken every precept of all people according to the Torah, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both with the book and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the testament which Elohim has enjoined unto you." And this is um, the additional text in our Midrash, Exodus 24:8, the second text that Paul is bringing together with Jeremiah 31 to make his Midrash. And we read then verse 21, "Moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry." Now, we have troublemakers, if you will, from within and from without, complaining that this introduces statements that are not mentioned in Torah. First of all, let's hit this phrase. "For in the day which Moshe wrote to the people the words of Yahweh in the Torah," Hebrews 9:1. That passage is very similar, going back to chapter 9, verse 1. That's one of their complaints. That's very similar to what we saw in Jeremiah 31, where it says, "In the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt," not a 24-hour day. So Paul is telescoping, is that the word for it? He's bringing together two events from two different time periods and kind of collapsing it. Okay. Paul mentions goats being offered, while Exodus only mentions bulls being offered. Of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is the old saying, a rule of logic. And while it's true the King James Version and some of the versions mention goats in this passage, the original text of Hebrews made no mention of goats. The Hebrew text of Hebrews that we have in the Munster doesn't have goats. The Aramaic Peshitta doesn't have goats. The CPA Aramaic texts don't have the goats. The phrase is also lacking in the oldest copy of Hebrews, P46, and in a lot of Greek copies. And there's a list of them here in your handout. So the word goats probably doesn't belong there anyway. Then we get on to the Exodus 24 account, which only mentions blood, not water, scarlet, wool, or hyssop. However, the Talmud records a tradition that the sprinkling with blood at Sinai was accompanied by a sprinkling of waters of purification. Tractate Yoma 4a in the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Lachish, "It is right according to me who infer from the consecration, for this agrees with what we are taught. On both of them, the priests, we sprinkle throughout the 7 days water from all the sin offerings that were there. But according to you, infer from Sinai, was there any sprinkling done on Sinai? But according to your own reasoning, it would not be right either, for in the consecration ceremony, the sprinkling was done with blood, whereas here with water, ? That is no difficulty. For Rabbi Haya taught, the water takes the place of blood. But according to you, was there any sprinkling on Sinai?" He answered, "It was a mere additional provision." So this tradition is recorded in the Talmud, and it discusses the use of the waters of purification, to purify the high priest before the Day of Atonement ceremony. The water was special water which had been added the ashes of the red heifer. These were the ashes of the red heifer burned with hyssop and scarlet wool, according to Numbers 19:6. So this is maybe what Paul is referring to. Also, Josephus records a tradition that Moses sprinkled the people with waters of purification at the funeral of Miriam. Moses, quoting from Josephus' Antiquities 4, Book 4, Chapter 4, Section 6, Moses purified the people after this manner. He brought a heifer that had been used to the plow, uh, had not been that had never been used to the plow or in husbandry, and was complete in all its parts, and entirely of a red color, a little distance from the camp into a place perfectly clean. This heifer was slain by the high priest. This is the red heifer, and her blood sprinkled with his finger 7 times before the tabernacle of God. After this, the entire heifer was burnt in that state together with its skin and entrails, and they threw cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet wool into the midst of the fire. Then a clean man gathered all the ashes together and laid them in a place perfectly clean. When therefore any persons were defiled by a dead body, they put a little of these ashes into spring water with hyssop, and dipping part of these ashes in it, they sprinkled them with it both on the 3rd day and on the 7th after they were clean. This he enjoined them to do also when the tribes should come into their own land. The Torah says in Exodus 24:6-8, and Moshe took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he dashed upon the altar, and he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people. They said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do and obey. And Moshe took blood and sprinkled it upon the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant. Thus Yahweh has made with you an agreement with all these words. Now, as our handout points out, the phrase in agreement with all these words can be translated upon all of these words. Moreover, the first rule of Hillel tells us that the Hebrew particles af, gam, and et indicate an inclusion or amplification. The Hebrew word et has no parallel in English, but it points to the next word as being the receiver of action as a direct object. If we were to include it in the English, it would read, and I won't read the whole thing, and Moshe took et, the blood, and sprinkled it upon the people. Since et indicates an inclusion, according to the first rule of Eliezer, then in rabbinic hermeneutics, it could be taken to indicate that with the phrase upon the altar and upon the people, that upon all these words would imply the blood was upon all 3 of these. All right. Now returning to verse 22. And almost all these things are by the Torah purified with blood, and by the Torah purged with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Messiah is not entered into the Holy of Holies made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but the heavens itself, now to appear in the presence of Elohim for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often as the high priest enters into the holy place every year with the blood of others. And then must he offer suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world has he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice himself. And as it is appointed unto men also once to die, but after this, the judgment. So Messiah was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them they took for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. So all of this that Paul has just described has its parallel in the Yom Kippur service that is laid out in Leviticus chapter 16, I believe. In this service, the high priest takes 2 goats. One is appointed to Yahweh, the other is appointed to Azazel. And this ties in to our very first study on the book of Hebrews. As you may recall, if you go back and review that, the Azazel. So, Hasatan. So he takes, so this comes back to Paul's first point at the beginning of the book of Hebrews, and the defeat of the Azazel. And what happens is he takes the high priest takes these two goats, one appointed to Yahweh and one's appointed to Azazel. He sacrifices the one appointed to Yahweh, which represents the Messiah here. The high priest represents the Messiah, and then uh, first the goat does. Then, since the goat is dead, the goat can no longer represents Messiah. The high priest represents the Messiah as he enters into the holy of holies. He sprinkles the blood there 7 times, representing becoming mediator of the new covenant, cleansing the sanctuary from sin, and opening the book sealed with 7 seals, because the Messiah does something with his blood there 7 times. Okay. And then he, after accomplishing this, the high priest comes out from the Holy of Holies, representing the return of the Messiah. And then when the Messiah returns, he brings with him the renewed covenant that he went in and he accomplished the work to renew, having opened the book sealed with 7 seals, passed the 7 judgments that only he could pass. And Then the high priest takes his hands and he lays them upon the Azazel, and the Azazel is driven out into the wilderness, um, representing the Hasatan being cast into the pit for 1,000 years and then to the lake of fire. And that, again, like I said, brings us full circle back to the beginning of the book of Hebrews, where it talked about. Let me see if I can find the passage here. I didn't have this in my notes to talk about, but as I got there, I realized, oh, yes, I need to point out that this brings us full circle back to where the Psalm says, here it is, verse 6. But one in a certain place testified, saying, what is man that you should be mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you should visit him? And we found that this is actually referring to Hasatan. Hasatan is in Jewish tradition understood as the speaker here, talking about man. And that this book then unfolds to then discuss the well, it goes on to talk about the defeat of Hasatan in verse 14. For as much then as the children are partakers of the flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil. This is tying in very much with the book of Enoch, and with the Azazel that's talked about in the book of Enoch. And that is why why Paul is tying this all in with Yom Kippur, particularly in Romans 9, with the Azazel, the negative outcome for the Azazel in that book and in the book of Enoch. Okay, next we will embark upon chapter 10, and we'll wrap up the book of Hebrews starting with chapter 10. I hope that you have learned something from this week's study of the book of Hebrews, and next week we will conclude the book of Hebrews. Shalom, everybody, and thanks for taking time to study with us.